No one could explain it. For 30 days straight, a stray dog nobody had ever seen before appeared at the iron gates of Millhaven Cemetery at first light and disappeared only after sunset. He did not beg for food from the groundskeeper. He did not follow visitors down the gravel paths. He did not curl up in the warmth near the chapel doorway, the way cold, lost animals sometimes do. He went to one grave, always the same one, a plain headstone at the far edge of the cemetery, pressed close to the tree line, in the section where the plots cost the least and the flowers came from no one. A section most visitors never reached. A section where, on rainy mornings, the groundskeeper sometimes forgot to walk. The dog would lower himself to the earth in front of that headstone, place his chin flat against the grass, and stay, motionless, patient, as if he were waiting for something only he could hear. People noticed, people talked, but no one did anything. Not until the morning a canine unit drove past the cemetery gates on an unrelated call, and the dog in the back of that police cruiser went absolutely rigid. His name was Atlas, and Atlas never lied. Before we go further, make sure to hit like and subscribe. And I'm genuinely curious, where are you watching from right now? Drop your country name in the comments below. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, let's go back to that cemetery. Millhaven was the kind of small town that showed up on maps but rarely in conversation. It sat 40 miles east of the nearest city, tucked between pine-covered ridgelines and a river that flooded every third spring. There was one diner, one mechanic, one school that covered grades kindergarten through 12, and one police department that operated out of a converted brick building on Main Street, with a single dispatcher named Cheryl who had worked the desk for 22 years and had never once called in sick. The cemetery, Millhaven Municipal, though everybody just called it Millhaven Cemetery, had been there longer than the town itself. Some of the stones near the front went back to the 1840s, their inscriptions worn smooth by 180 winters. A wrought iron fence ringed the perimeter, and a gravel path wound through it like a question mark, from the arched entrance all the way to the tree line at the back, where the newer plots were cut into soil that was darker and softer and never quite fully dried. It was October when the stray dog first appeared, the kind of October that arrives in full force, frost on the windshields before 6 a.m., leaves that turned not gradually but seemingly overnight, as if the trees had simply decided they were finished. The morning smelled of pine sap and cold earth, and the distant, particular smoke of somebody's fireplace catching the season's first use. Millhaven was quiet. It was always quiet, which is precisely why, when something broke the quiet, everyone heard it. Detective Sergeant Nolan Gray had not taken a proper day off in 14 months. He was 43 years old and looked 50. Not because he was unhealthy. Nolan ran 4 miles every morning before the sun cleared the ridge, drank his coffee black, and could still outpace officers a decade younger than him on a foot pursuit through underbrush. He looked 50 because grief had a way of settling into the face and staying there. It carved lines where there hadn't been lines. It took the light out of the eyes and replaced it with something harder, something careful. 14 months ago, his partner, Detective Ray Okafor, had been shot during a routine traffic stop on Route 9. The call had come back as a stalled vehicle. It was anything but. Ray had stepped out of the cruiser and into the worst 3 seconds of his life. He didn't survive them. Nolan had been in the passenger seat. He'd replayed those 3 seconds approximately 11,000 times since. He'd been placed on administrative leave for 6 weeks. He'd seen the department counselor 18 times. He'd eventually been cleared to return to active duty. And he had, because sitting still was worse than moving, and Millhaven was small enough that it needed every officer it had. He requested reassignment to the K9 unit. The department only had one K9, a 3-year-old Belgian Malinois named Atlas, who had been trained in narcotics detection, search and rescue, and cadaver location. His previous handler had retired on a medical leave after a knee surgery that didn't ache. Atlas had been sitting in the kennel for 2 months, worked daily by the kennel master but unparted, restless. A coiled thing looking for direction. The first time Nolan entered that kennel, Atlas did not bark. He did not circle or posture. He stood at the far end of his run, watched Nolan with amber eyes that seemed to take inventory of something, and then, after a moment that felt unreasonably long, walked calmly to the gate and sat. Nolan crouched to eye level. Atlas held the stare. "Okay," Nolan said quietly, to the dog or to himself. It wasn't entirely clear. "Okay." That had been 8 months ago. In those 8 months, Nolan and Atlas had run 17 search operations, contributed to 4 drug seizures, located 2 missing hikers, and found one elderly man with dementia who had wandered 2 miles from his home in a February snowstorm and was sitting, unhurt but very cold, against a pine tree at the edge of a creek bed. They were, by every measure, a good team. But Nolan still had trouble sleeping, and Atlas still slept across the foot of his bed every night, as if the dog understood that keeping watch was sometimes the only comfort that mattered. It was a Tuesday when it started, the way most things in Millhaven started, quietly, without warning, disguised as nothing. Nolan was driving back from a routine welfare check on the north side of town when he passed Millhaven Cemetery on Orchard Road. The morning was grey and still. Frost had laced itself across the iron fence posts, and the gravel path inside was empty except for a groundskeeper making his rounds near the chapel. Atlas sat in the back of the cruiser the way he always did, attentive, ears forward, scanning. Then every muscle in his body locked. Nolan saw it in the rearview mirror. It was not the lazy alertness Atlas showed when something caught his interest. This was different. This was the full system freeze, the kind that meant something real, something the dog's training had specifically prepared him to recognize. His nostrils worked in rapid, shallow pulls. His ears pressed flat and then forward again, rotating like satellite dishes. Atlas. The dog didn't look at him. He was staring through the passenger window at the cemetery. Nolan slowed the cruiser to a stop on the shoulder. Through the fence, at the far edge of the cemetery near the tree line, he could just make out the shape of a dog, medium-sized, rough-coated, the color of dried mud, lying flat in front of a headstone, motionless, chin to the ground. The stray. Nolan had heard about the stray. Cheryl had mentioned it twice in the past week. Some dog keeps hanging around the cemetery. Groundskeeper called it in. Animal control said they'd look into it. But animal control in Millhaven was a part-time position, and looking into things sometimes meant getting around to it by the end of the month. He studied the scene for a moment. Then he looked at Atlas again. Atlas had not moved. His nose was pressed to the wire mesh partition, trembling with effort. Whatever Atlas was detecting, it wasn't the stray dog. It was something beneath the ground. Nolan's jaw tightened. He reached for his radio. He didn't call it in immediately. That was the thing about Nolan Gray. He didn't act on instinct alone, because instinct without information could destroy lives. He had learned that the hard way. He had watched it happen. He had stood in courtrooms and listened to testimony built on gut feelings and faulty memory, and the confirmation bias of people who had already decided what the answer was. So instead of calling it in, he parked the cruiser, leashed Atlas, and walked through the cemetery gates. The groundskeeper, a heavy-set man named Vernon Briggs who had worked the cemetery for 9 years, spotted them near the chapel and lifted a hand. "Morning, officer." "Morning, Vernon." Nolan kept his voice easy, conversational. "That stray still coming around?" Vernon pointed toward the tree line without hesitation. "Every single day, rain or shine. That dog is over there by 7 a.m. and doesn't leave until after dark. Been doing it a full month now." He paused. "Is it a problem?" "Not sure yet." "What grave is he at?" Vernon squinted. "Henry Marsh. Died 3 years ago. Section G, Plot 14. "You know Henry Marsh?" "Knew of him. Lived alone up on Cutter's Ridge. Quiet man. Kept to himself." Vernon rubbed the back of his neck. "Nobody comes to visit that plot. Not once in 3 years. I'd have noticed." Nolan nodded, thanked him, and walked. The stray dog heard them coming and lifted its head. It was a mixed breed, something shepherd-like in the build, with a narrow face and eyes the color of winter sky. Thin, but not starved. Watchful. As they approached, it did not run. It did not growl. It simply watched them with an expression that, if you were the kind of person who believed animals had expressions, looked very much like relief. Atlas, for his part, was not interested in the stray. He was pulling toward the headstone. Nolan let the leash run long and watched as Atlas circled the grave twice, his nose working the perimeter in tight, focused arcs. Then the dog sat, square, back straight, unambiguous, is trained alert. The one that meant here, right here. Nolan looked at the headstone. Henry Marsh. 1951, 2021. Age rest. Nothing unusual about it. Standard granite. No personal inscription. No decorations. The grass above the plot had grown and fully undisturbed. Atlas sat and stared at the ground. Nolan stared with him. Then he reached for his radio. He did not get a warrant. Not yet. What he had was a dog alert, and while Atlas's accuracy rate was excellent, a dog alert alone was not cause to open a grave. Nolan knew the law. He respected it even when it frustrated him. What he did do was go back to the station and spend 6 hours going through every document the Millhaven Police Department had ever generated with the name Henry Marsh attached to it. There was more than he expected. Henry Marsh had lived in Millhaven his entire life. He worked for 20 years at the lumber mill east of town before it closed, and after that had largely survived off a small pension and a vegetable garden. No criminal record, no domestic complaints. By all accounts, a man who moved through the world without leaving much of a mark on it. Except for one thing. In the summer of 2018, 3 years before Henry Marsh died, a local man named Calvin Pruitt had been convicted of murder. The victim was a woman named Dara Solano, 29 years old, found in the creek bed behind the old mill. The investigation had lasted 11 weeks. No direct witnesses. No murder weapon ever recovered. The prosecution's case rested primarily on circumstantial evidence. Calvin Pruitt had argued with Dara Solano in public 2 weeks before her death. His truck had been seen on the road near the mill that evening, and a hunting knife found in his toolbox, which he insisted was for field dressing deer, had tested positive for traces of blood that the lab could not definitively type. Calvin Pruitt had maintained his innocence every single day of the trial. He was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 22 years. He had been in Dalton State Correctional Facility for 5 years now. He'd exhausted 2 appeals. His third and final appeal was pending. Nolan read the trial transcript until his eyes burned, and then he found it, in the margin of an investigative note written by the detective who had run the original case, a man named Sergeant Dale Fitch, who had since retired. A single line, handwritten and crossed out. H. Marsh, possible witness, road near mill. Check. No follow-up. No documentation of whether Marsh had ever been contacted. No interview transcript. Nothing in the file to indicate the lead had ever been pursued. Nolan set the paper down very carefully. He pressed his knuckles against the desk and breathed. Atlas, lying on his mat in the corner of the office, lifted his head and watched him. "I know," Nolan said quietly. He picked up the phone. The first person Nolan called was the county medical examiner's office. He asked a simple question. Was there anything about Henry Marsh's death 3 years ago that had been flagged as unusual or inconsistent? There was a long pause on the other end, the sound of files being pulled. Then, the cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest. He was found in his home by a neighbor who noticed the mail hadn't been collected. There was no autopsy. No reason to flag it at the time. He was 70 years old with a documented history of heart disease. Any secondary indicators? Anything that in retrospect might look different? Another pause. Longer this time. There was a note in the file from the responding officer. So the front door was unlocked and the house was unusually neat, like cleaned recently, which struck the officer as odd because the neighbor said Marsh wasn't what you'd call a neat man. Nolan wrote that down. The second call was to Dale Fitch. The retired sergeant answered on the third ring from what sounded like a porch, wind in the background, a distant radio. His voice was careful when Nolan introduced himself. Not hostile, just careful. "The Pruitt case," Nolan said. "There's a note in the file about Henry Marsh as a possible witness. I'm trying to understand why it wasn't followed up." Silence. A longer silence than felt natural. "We interviewed a lot of people," Fitch said finally. "Not everybody panned out. There's no record of Marsh being interviewed at all." More silence. "I'd have to look at my notes." "I'd appreciate that." Fitch said he'd call back. He didn't. The third call was to the property records office. This one was the one that made Nolan's breath go shallow. Henry Marsh had owned 1.2 acres of land on Cutter's Ridge, including the house, a detached outbuilding, and this was the part, a small plot of land immediately adjacent to the creek bed behind the old mill, the same creek bed where Dara Solano's body had been found. Henry Marsh had owned land 30 feet from the crime scene, and no one had ever interviewed him. Nolan sat with that for a long time. The office was quiet. The afternoon light had gone long and amber through the windows. Atlas had moved from his mat to sit directly beside Nolan's chair, pressing his warm flank against his handler's leg. Nolan put his hand on the dog's back without looking down. Something cold stirred in his chest. Not fear exactly. Something older. The feeling of a truth that has been buried for a long time, beginning to push upward through the earth. He called the county judge's clerk's office at 4:47 p.m. He said he needed to speak with Judge Carla Whitmore about an emergency application. He was told the judge was in session until 5. "I'll wait," he said. Getting an exhumation warrant in a small county is not a fast process. It requires documented probable cause, a review from the county coroner, sign-off from the presiding judge, and in most cases, a waiting period of at least 72 hours. Nolan presented what he had. The K9 alert, documented, time-stamped, recorded on the cruiser's dash camera. The uncollected investigative lead from the Pruitt trial, the proximity of Marsh's land to the crime scene. The cleaned house. The locked question of what, exactly, was buried under that grave. Judge Whitmore was a precise woman. She read everything Nolan gave her without expression and asked 3 clarifying questions. She did not appear impressed. She did not appear dismissive. She appeared, above all, thorough. "This is highly unusual," she said. "Yes, ma'am." A K9 alert on a grave is not by itself sufficient cause. "No, ma'am." The alert is one component of a broader evidentiary picture. She looked at the file again, at the handwritten note, at the property map. "There is a man in a state correctional facility whose final appeal is pending," Nolan said. "If there is exculpatory evidence in that grave, and we don't look, and that appeal fails, I have to live with that, and so does this court." Whitmore looked at him over the top of her reading glasses. Then she signed. 72 hours, she said. "Find me something." The exhumation was scheduled for Saturday morning at 7 a.m. Nolan didn't sleep much in the 72 hours between. On Friday, the day before the exhumation, Nolan went back to the cemetery. He told himself it was a precautionary check of the site. That was partly true. The fuller truth was that he wanted to see the stray again. The dog was there. Of course it was. Same position, same grave, same patient, unreadable vigil. The frost had returned overnight, and the stray's breath came in visible puffs above the headstone. Nolan crouched down about 10 feet away. The stray looked at him, not with wariness, with something that was harder to name. Nolan took a piece of jerky from his jacket pocket, he always carried it, for Atlas's training sessions, and held it out flat in his palm. The stray watched him, then, slowly, stepped forward and took it from his hand with a gentleness that seemed almost deliberate. Nolan studied the dog up close. No collar, no tags, but his coat, though rough and weather-beaten, had been kept, not the coat of a dog who had been on his own for months or years. This was a dog who had recently been cared for. Recently lost. He pulled up the county animal registration database on his phone. Searched stray reports for the past 60 days. Nothing matching this description. He typed in another search, Henry Marsh, property of animals. The results took a moment, and there it was. Filed 3 years ago by a neighbor who had called animal control after Marsh's death. One mixed-breed dog. Male, approximately 4 years old. Rough gray-brown coat. Light eyes, never claimed. Transferred to Millhaven Animal Shelter in October of that year. Nolan called the shelter. The woman who answered told him that a dog matching that description had been adopted out about a year after Marsh's death. The adopting family had moved to Harrowfield, about 30 miles west, 6 months ago. Apparently, the dog had run off during the move. They'd filed a missing animal report, she said. They'd been looking for him. Nolan looked at the stray. The dog had traveled 30 miles. Back to this grave. Back to the man who'd raised him. Something in Nolan's chest cracked open very quietly, like ice on a warming river. "Okay," he said softly. "I hear you." He called the shelter back and told them to note that the dog had been located. Safe. He'd arranged transport to the family once things were resolved. He left a bowl of water from his cruiser and drove home. He didn't sleep that night either. The B Pugila morning arrived cold and overcast, the sky the color of old pewter. The exhumation team arrived at 7 a.m. As ordered, the county coroner's office, 2 forensic technicians, a representative from the medical examiner's office, and Nolan, with Atlas on a long leash nearby. The groundskeeper, Vernon, had been briefed and stood near the chapel with his hands in his pockets and the expression of a man trying very hard not to have opinions. The stray dog was there. He did not run when the team set up around the grave. He retreated a few feet and sat at the base of a nearby oak tree, watching. Atlas, off to the side with Nolan, was completely still. The same rigid, waiting posture he'd held in the back of the cruiser 6 days ago. The earth was harder than expected. It took 90 minutes. What they found first was the coffin, as expected. A simple pine box, county standard for a man with no estate to speak of. The lid was opened under full forensic protocol. Photographed, logged, the contents examined. Henry Marsh was there. Undisturbed, as expected. It was what was beside him that made the forensic technician go still. Wrapped in a heavy gauge plastic sleeve, sealed with industrial tape, and tucked tightly alongside the body in the coffin, as if placed there deliberately, as if placed there by someone who knew it would be undisturbed for a very long time, was a waterproof container. Inside the container, a notebook. The forensic tech held it up. Nolan looked at it. Looked at Atlas. Atlas stared straight back at him, still as a carved thing. Amber eyes, unwavering. "Good boy," Nolan whispered. "Good boy!" The notebook went to the county lab. Nolan was on the phone to the DA's office before the team had finished packing up. It took 11 days to complete the laboratory analysis, chain of custody documentation, and legal verification. 11 days during which Nolan barely slept, barely ate anything that wasn't handed to him by Cheryl from the diner 2 blocks down, and took Atlas on 4-mile runs every morning that were really just an excuse to move his body because his mind refused to rest. He was the first one cold when the results came in. The notebook was real. The handwriting had been verified against Henry Marsh's known samples. The notebook had been written over a period of several weeks and was dated in the summer of 2018. The same summer Dara Solano was killed. What it contained was a confession. Not of murder, of witness. Henry Marsh had written, in his careful and unschooled handwriting, that on the night of July 14, 2018, he had been walking his land near the creek bed. He often walked his land at night, couldn't sleep. His joints were bad and movement helped when he heard voices, an argument. He had stopped. He had watched. He had seen the man who killed Dara Solano. And it was not Calvin Pruitt, the man Henry Marsh described in careful, deliberate detail, including a partial license plate, a distinctive scar on the left forearm, and a vehicle make, was Dale Fitch, the detective who had run the investigation. The man who had written Henry Marsh's name in his notes and then crossed it out. Henry Marsh wrote that he had gone home that night and been terrified. He didn't know what to do. He'd sat with it for days. He'd eventually called the police station, anonymously, because he was afraid, and asked to speak to someone about the Solano case. He'd been transferred to Fitch's desk. He'd hung up without speaking. He'd tried again, twice more. Both times transferred to Fitch. After the third time, a car he didn't recognize had driven slowly past his property at 2 in the morning. He stopped trying. He wrote it all down instead. Every detail. Everything he'd seen. He wrote it down because he was an old man who was afraid of dying without telling the truth. And he was afraid of telling the truth while he was alive. He had placed the notebook in the coffin himself. He had arranged it with the funeral director 2 weeks before his death. in a sealed package labeled "Personal Effects, to be interred with the deceased." The funeral director had not questioned it. People left things with their dead all the time. Photographs, letters, keepsakes. A sealed package was not unusual. Henry Marsh had carried a secret that could free an innocent man, and he had carried it to his grave. Almost literally. The DA's office filed an emergency motion to the appellate court on a Wednesday afternoon. By Thursday morning, a stay of Calvin Pruitt's pending appeal had been issued. By Friday, Dale Fitch, retired for 4 years, living in a lakeside cabin 2 counties over, had been arrested at his front door by a joint task force from the state police and the county sheriff's office. He did not go quietly. He did not deny it either. Not for long. When confronted with a notebook, with a verified handwriting, with a partial plate number that had been cross-referenced to a vehicle registered to Fitch during the summer of 2018, something in him appeared to collapse. The arrogance fell away. He sat in an interview room in the state police barracks and stared at the table for a very long time. And then he started talking. He had known Dara Solano. They had been in a relationship, a secret one, because Fitch was married and Solano was 20 years younger, and neither of them had wanted the complexity of what it had become. The argument that night had been about that complexity. It had escalated in the way that arguments sometimes do. Past the point where either person is thinking clearly, past the point where anything rational is left. Fitch had panicked afterward. He had used his authority over the investigation to misdirect it. He had built a case against Calvin Pruitt, a man he knew from town who had genuinely argued with Solano publicly, making him a convenient target, and he had suppressed everything that might have pointed toward the truth, including a handwritten note about a potential witness on Cutter's Ridge, including Henry Marsh. Calvin Pruitt was released from Dalton State Correctional Facility on a cold Tuesday morning in November, 51 days after the exhumation. He walked out of the front gates in a jacket his daughter had brought him, bright blue, too large because she hadn't known his size after 5 years, and stood blinking in the thin November sunlight with the expression of a man trying to remember what outside felt like. His daughter was crying. Calvin Pruitt did not cry. He was a quiet man, and he had been quiet for 5 years of wrongful imprisonment, and he remained quiet now. He looked up at the sky for a moment. Just looked at it, the way you look at something ordinary that has become extraordinary through its absence. And then he put his arm around his daughter's shoulders and walked to the car. Nolan Gray was not there for the release. He had not been invited, and he hadn't expected to be. His job had been to find the truth. What Pruitt did with his freedom was Pruitt's own. But 3 weeks later, Nolan received a letter in the mail. No return address, but the postmark was from a town 40 miles north of Millhaven. It was a single page written in careful, deliberate block letters. It said, "I don't know who to thank. My daughter says there was a dog. I think that's the part I like best. Thank the dog." Nolan folded the letter and kept it in his desk drawer, beside the photograph of Ray Okafor that he'd had there for 14 months and was only now beginning to look at without flinching. The stray had a name. It was Murphy. Nolan had learned this from the family in Harrowfield when he'd finally called to arrange the return. A young couple, early 30s, with a 7-year-old daughter named Josie, who burst into tears the moment she heard Murphy had been found. "He just ran during the move," the mother explained. "We looked for weeks. We thought..." She stopped. "He's okay," Nolan said. "He's been well looked after." He paused. "By people who care a lot about where he ended up." He drove Murphy to Harrowfield on a Sunday. Josie was waiting on the front porch when they pulled up, and Murphy, who had been calm and quiet for the entire drive, pressed his nose against the window the moment the car turned onto their street. His tail, which had wagged only sparingly during his 5 weeks at the cemetery, became a blur. He was out of the car before Nolan had fully opened the door. Josie went to her knees in the driveway, and Murphy hit her at full speed and knocked her backward into the grass. And she was laughing and crying at the same time, and Murphy was making a low, continuous sound that was not quite a whine and not quite a bark, but something that sat squarely between the two. The sound of a creature who has been waiting for something for a very long time and has finally found it. Nolan watched from beside the car. He felt Atlas press against his leg from behind. He reached down and put his hand on the dog's head. Henry would have liked this, Nolan said quietly. To Atlas, or to himself, or to no one in particular. It didn't matter much. Atlas leaned into his hand and stayed there. In the weeks that followed, Nolan Gray made 2 phone calls that he had been putting off for over a year. The first was to Ray O'Caffer's wife, Denise. He had called her on the anniversaries of Ray's death and on the major holidays because it had felt like the right thing to do. But those calls had always been brief, careful, full of the particular awkwardness of survivor's guilt dressed up as courtesy. This call was different. He told her about the case, about the notebook, about Atlas alerting on a grave, about a dead man who hadn't been able to speak the truth in life but had found a way to speak it in death. He wasn't sure why he told her, maybe because Ray had been the kind of man who would have believed a dog, who would have parked the cruiser and walked through the gates and trusted his animal partner's nose over his own reluctance. Denise listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When he finished, there was a moment of silence. Ray would have loved that story, she said. Yeah, Nolan said. He really would have. The second call was to the department counselor. He scheduled an appointment for the following week. Not because anyone made him. Not because it was required. Because 14 months was a long time to carry something alone. And because a stray dog who had walked 30 miles back to a dead man's grave to tell the living something important, had reminded Nolan of a thing he had somewhere along the way forgotten. Loyalty is not about staying silent. It is about refusing to leave until the truth is heard. We say the dead cannot speak, but sometimes they leave behind the ones who knew them, the ones who loved them, the ones who will lie down on the cold earth and wait, for days, for weeks, for however long it takes, until someone finally stops and pays attention. Murphy did not know anything about justice or wrongful conviction or the slow machinery of the law. He only knew that something was wrong, and he refused to leave until it was made right. Maybe that's all any of us can do. Stay, pay attention, don't walk away.